Hello, everyone. Welcome back to TPS training. My name is Lewis Weber with Behavior Care. In this segment, we're going to hop around a little bit to some of the tabs that do some very interesting things for us in TPS, but aren't worth spending uh, or dedicating an entire training to. So we're going to look at the MGT tab, and we're going to look at the H1 tab, and we're also going to take a look at the IEP tab. So let's go back to the MGT, which is short for management. The MGT tab is, like many of the specialized tabs, really handy and generally underutilized because of the press of daily school day just to get the regular TPS data collected. We don't really program in our day, schedule in our day enough time to look at some of these additional tabs. And that's one of the reasons that I'm doing this training here today is to direct your attention to some of these underutilized tabs that are put in for a really great reason. That is to take the TPS data and give a new message, to communicate a new message of progress. One of those is the management tab. And what this does is displays an average of the increasing targets and decreasing targets for each student. And you can see here, I only have data displayed for Pete, but if I had entered more data in, you would see it for each of the students. And what this does is allows us to take on one page to communicate. Well, let's do it this way: for TPS to communicate to you how all of your students in your TPS file are doing. It's a great way to share performance with um, a behavior specialist or with the principal of the school or assistant principal or anyone that you want to share the overall progress of the classroom. So let's just zoom in a little bit on Pete's data and take a look at what's going on here. I'll scroll over. So each dot is a week. And I think this is like every fourth week, something like that, just to keep it from being too cluttered. We're just looking for overall trends, not so much specific days or specific weeks for each data point. It's really just to get the feel for how each student is doing. So each data point is the average of the increasing and decreasing target behaviors for the week of their percentages. And so we see overall that Pete has been doing quite well and recently had a nice increase in his increasing target behaviors. Now these are averages, so if you have, well, just one target behavior, then it would be a pretty direct sharing of the data that you've collected. If you have two or three or four target behaviors, then of course it's going to average them. Same thing for the decreasing targets, of course. So if you just have one decreasing target behavior, it will be just displayed that way as that target behavior. The more decreasing target behaviors, the more the average is going to move around based on each target behavior. So if you have, particularly with the decreasing target behaviors, if you have decreasing target behaviors that are commonly observed, like let's say um, uh, verbal aggression, that may push up that average somewhat. And you might also have some less frequently observed and more severe behaviors like self-injurious behavior and so forth. So you just have to know that you're averaging, or that this graph is averaging the percentages for the week for your increasing and decreasing target behavior. Overall, we just want to look at the trends. We're not looking for any detailed analysis here. And as I scroll back, it's really nice to be able to print this page, or to print it as a PDF, which is something we'll maybe talk about another time, and email that to say how we're doing. And it's handy. And I encourage anyone who's using TPS to take a look at their classroom using the MGT and say, hey, how is everyone doing? And this will convey to you exactly that. And it's a very useful uh, set of graphs, and it's one of my go-tos when I review a classroom TPS data file. Okay, so that's it. Pretty straightforward. The next one we'll go to is the IEP, which you know what that stands for. And there's a lot of boxes here. And again, we're going to do Pete's data. So we would click on Pete, and this is a tab that I would like for everyone to use who have students with behavioral intervention plans and IEP goals. So let's take a look at some of the boxes here. This increasing target behavior 1 is linked directly to the increasing target behavior, the first increasing target behavior for Pete. So we see respect, and it's embedded in all of this text. So what TPS does is it goes to look and see what it is that's being measured for the first increasing target behavior, and that gets automatically included in this goal. Now, we have some other things going on here. We have a percentage as a goal. Now, that percentage is linked to G3. So let's take a look at G3 for a sec here. Okay, these numbers right here under ratings, those are the percentages that the IEP writer, the IEP tab, are going to use. So right now, Pete has a yearly average of 64.1%. Now, when we go back to the IEP tab, I'll scroll to right here, we go back to the IEP tab, that percentage, again, I'm going to flip back, that 64% is being used to create a new goal. And it says here 77%. Make that a bit larger. Why 77%? Because under this column here, I have indicated that I would like a 20% increase. So the 64%, which is Pete's current performance, average for the year, is going to be increased by 20%, and that percentage is automatically computed for you in TPS as 77%. And so it writes this annual goal. And you can read it here using this rating system. Pete will increase the percentage of rating points earned for respect. And of course, it's applying that automatically because that is the first target behavior to greater than or equal to 77% as recorded by teachers' observations. Now, if that's enough for your particular need for writing the IEP goal, then that's great. Now, you may want to add to that, and I'm going to show you a little bit later what we'll do to add to that. Now, before we get any further, we can see here in the blue boxes, enter the names of recording blocks where the teacher's behavior, target behavior will be recorded. If all recording blocks are used, leave it blank. Okay. Well, let's say that this particular goal was going to be monitored during science and let's just say ELA. And when I hit enter, it's now going to put in the words during science and ELA. So that way you can write a goal if you wanted to, which would put the goal in a particular recording block or academic blocks. If you're going to have it as an all-day affair, then you just leave it blank and it will take that out. Okay, so that's how this section works. Now let's say we wanted a little bit higher percent. We would say, you know what, I'm going to do not 20%, I would like to see a 25% increase. So you know what's going to happen. TPS is going to recompute a 25% increase off of the G3 average for the year, which was 64%. 25% more than that is 80%. So you can adjust these percentages as you want. Maybe you wanted a lower increase based on current levels. So now it's 74%. So 15% more than the 64% that we saw right here is 74%. As a rule, I should say as a general idea of what's appropriate here, I guess we could call that a rule. I like to go at least start with 20% and consider that. That's a good improvement from one year to the next. Okay, you decide what the percentage is going to be. All right, let's work our way down a little bit. I'm going to make this just a little bit smaller so we can see some more text. Here's the annual goal. That's a 20% increase. But I also have 3 objectives. So it's 3 objectives, and each objective would be aligned with a quarter of the school year. So the school goal, the goal for the school year is 77%, which would be the 4th quarter of the school year. Well, we have objectives which are aligning with each of the 3 quarters of the school year. Now look what TPS is doing for you. It's taking the 20% improvement for the year, and it's saying, well, if we allocated that to 4 quarters, the first quarter of the school year would be a 5% increase, which would be 67% of an improvement off of the 64% current level. Next quarter would be a 10% improvement, which brings the goal up to, or objective, up to 70%. The third objective is a 15% increase, which would bring it up to 74%. And then we, of course, have the 20% as the final objective, but this, because it's the end of the school year, it's the annual goal, it's 77%. Now, if we change that, as we did before, to 25%, then TPS is going to say, okay, the first goal, the first objective is 6%. The second objective is 13%. The third objective is 19%. And the final objective, which then is the annual goal, is 25%. And for each of these, it uses the current value of 64% from G3 to compute the objective. So 6% more than 64% is 68, 13% more is 72%, 19% more is 76%, and 25% is 80% for the annual goal. So all of this is done automatically for you, which makes it really handy. You don't have to do any of the calculations, and it writes the goal, which is displayed right here. Now, as we scroll down, we have the second target behavior, which is on task. And those percentages are going to be the same here because I put 20% as the default. So that's the same, but when we go back to G3, we see we're working off of 65%. And for acceptance, of self and others, we're working on 58%. So when we go back to our IEP, 20% annual goal is going to be a 79% result, or I should say the 20% increase based on current performance will be 79% as a goal. We scroll down to target behavior 3, the annual goal is 70%. So 20% more than 58.5% is 70%, and so forth. And for each of those, the objectives based on this 20% as is allocated among 3 different goals, the resulting percentages are calculated for you. So very handy. All right, there's the 4th increasing target. Now the decreasing target is the same thing, but, or I should say it's computed in the same way, but with subtraction rather than addition. So what that means is we go to G3 and we use the 4% and the 1.9 and the 1%, etc. And IEP goals will then be decreased by 20%. So just to go through that first example, the rating percent was 4 for verbal aggression. And so when we go back to the IEP, 20% less than 4% is 3%. Now, when you get to these smaller percentages, the objectives aren't going to be different, and that's because this percentage, these percentages are rounded. So there is a difference here, but it's not enough difference to show a full percentage point. So you end up getting some duplication, and that's fine. You don't need to use the objectives then if your annual goal is so low. And you'll see that here we're now already 20% less for the decreasing target behavior number 2. Excuse me, I went to the wrong one. Okay, we're already down to 1.9%. So when we go to reduce that by 20%, its annual goal is 1%, but we only have 2%. It's just not enough of a change to be able to show a 20% decrease and still keep whole numbers. And that's fine. So just use your annual goal and forget about the objective. You don't need to use the objectives. They're included as much of TPS as this way when you need it. It comes to you automatically. Okay. And once again, let me just scroll back to that first behavior, decreasing target. If you thought a 20% decrease was too much and you just wanted to change it to a 10% decrease, then that will change your percentage accordingly. And it will make different intermediate objectives as well. Now, again, they're not showing up because we don't have enough decimal points being displayed here for us to see the difference between a 3, a 5, and an 8% decrease. Not enough of a change. So in that case, we would once again just use the annual goal. But you decide. Now, if the student has a high frequency, well, let's just say a high percentage, which is based on frequency, duration, or intensity of behavior per the rubrics that we'll cover in another training. If the student has a high percentage of rating points for decreasing target behavior, let's say the student, we were measuring verbal aggression, and the student has, let's say, 50% of rating points earned. Sometimes we see that. That's a lot to decrease, right? And so it's not realistic for the year to say, well, we're just going to make it 0. They're not going to do it anymore. And so we don't want to make such an extreme case because we're not going to be able to meet that goal. So what we would do is say if the student was at 50%, maybe we would want to decrease it by 25% or 30% or something, but not necessarily by 100%. So if this rating percentage on G3 was 50%, we wouldn't want to just say, okay, you're going to reduce it by 100%, bring it down to 0. That's not a realistic goal. And so the IEP writer allows us to come up with an intermediate value to say, well, he's at 50% now, we're going to knock that down by 30%. And so that's going to end up being somewhere around a 35% annual goal, just to do the quick math, because it's not reasonable to just say, yep, this year they're going to stop doing it altogether. So the percentage decrease is really important as a way to keep this real. Yes, we would like a 0% for all of our decreasing target behaviors. Well, but they're not there. So what's a reasonable decrease in percentage? And so rarely do I put more than 40% as a decrease, because that's just a really big change. Even though we want it, it's a lot to expect it. Okay, so final part of this is how to communicate this to your liaisons. And here it just says copy the IEP goal, which that's exactly what it does, is it copies all of your text with all of its numbers. And then you paste as a picture paste as text in your Word document. So if I bring up the Word document now, it's going to be outside of my recording video right here. So what you do is you bring up Word, and there's a paste submenu that comes up. There's a little arrow below paste. You click on that, and then you paste using the far right submenu, which is just to paste the text, and then paste that into your Word document, and then you can add and do anything you want to the text of your IEP goal, save it as a Word document or a PDF, and send that to your liaison. and then they can cut and paste, or if you just send it as a Word document, that's probably the easiest way to send it, so they can cut and paste into Enrich or whatever software will be used in the future as the IEP goals. So that works really well, and I encourage you to use that. It doesn't make a lot of sense to write some other kind of goal. For example, to say, well, we want 4 out of 5 trials to be successful or something like that. That's not linked to your ongoing performance. So let the IEP goal writer do that for you. Okay. Finally, in this segment, and this will be, we won't spend too much time on this. Let's see, where is it? I'm looking, oh, it's right next to it, H1, there it is. Okay, here's Pete's data, or I should say his text from um, the notes section of data entry. So let's just go over to that real quick to show you that. So here, data entry for Pete, all of the text that has been entered in the notes section, there's more up on top, will be accessed by the H1 tab. Let's go back to H1. There it is. Now, we want to update it before we do anything else. So it says click the name to update. I'm going to do that. So now Pete's notes are updated. Let's take a closer look at what's going on here. Each note is listed by the date and the recording block and then the note. So we get to see on which days the notes were entered and when the note was written. Now, if you see a 0, as we do on 812, let's go over to that. That's because I had copied some notes over. Let's get rid of that. I'm actually making a bit of a correction right here. I had copied some notes over from another file as a demo. There is no academic block there, so that's why I put a 0 there. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to H1, and I'm going to click on Pete, and it will get rid of that. Okay, so in those cases, some data were entered without an academic block, which normally wouldn't happen. So let's just make that change real quick. 823. And we see here that just some sample data was put in there. Let's get rid of that. That wouldn't be there. You would have entered it somewhere using these recording blocks. Okay, I'm going to click on each block again. And that gets rid of those zeros. Well, we got one more. Let's just not worry about that. Okay, so here's the deal. The date, academic block, note. Now, if you don't see anything listed as an academic block, that's because it's a home note detail. So let's go to 812, and I want to show you what that means. So on 812, I had put some text here as a home note in this, we'll call it cyan color, and that's not associated with any academic block. That shows up as just a home note detail, and so there is no academic block to be listed there. So when we go back to H1, there isn't for 812 any academic block or recording block, so it just puts the colon right there. So that way we know it's one of those kinds of notes. Okay, so now what do we do? We got this here when we updated it by clicking on piece name, and everything was brought over from data entry. What this does is it takes out the blanks. You'll know that we didn't record something during every academic block, okay? And then you see that there's this green box here. And so then what you do is click in the middle of it, not on the bottom of it like I just did, because that will drag it. We don't want to do that. Click in the middle and hold your mouse down and just go like that. And it now copies when I right click on my mouse and I click copy. Now that's selected, and then once again I go into Word and I paste as text, just like I did with my IEP goals, and it lists it out really nicely in a Word document, which provides a tremendous amount of detail for all of the other graphs that and tables that you'll be sharing in any kind of TPS data report. Okay, so there we go. We've reviewed the MGT file. We have reviewed the IEP writer and the notes copier. Let's just hit escape to get rid of all those dancing dashes. And I hope that's been useful for you. Some of the lesser talked about tabs, but they were put in for all those very good reasons. And I hope you can take advantage of them. Okay, well, thanks for participating in this training. Once again, Lewis Weber with Behavior Care and TPS Training.